Hey folks, welcome back. We're continuing course reading through the Bible. We're in the book of First Samuel, and man, I missed a day yesterday, and there's a lot that's going on here in this book of First Samuel, and I always have a hard time kind of trying to figure out when I miss days, as I will at times. Do I try to kind of recapture the best of, or do I just kind of talk about some things from that particular day? But I think what I'm wanting to do is to kind of keep with the theme that I've been on the most, and that's to try to focus in on things that help to connect the big story that we're telling, or really interesting things about important characters in the biblical story, or about things that we're being reminded of about God, or about our responsibility, or things maybe for us to wrestle with a little bit. So, and there'll be times when, like today, so today's reading, I believe at the tail end, will cover like David and Goliath, right? Which is like, of course, super well-known story. I'm not going to really talk about that at all. Of course, it's an important story. It's one that we probably many of us know well. I don't want to make any assumptions about how familiar we are or aren't, but that's again the reason why we are reading through the Bible. This is not me commenting through the whole Bible. The idea of what I'm doing here is you can certainly watch or listen in whether you're doing the Bible reading or not, but what I'm doing is not a substitute for reading through the Bible the way that I'm doing myself. And you will absolutely miss things if you're only watching or listening to me and not doing the Bible reading yourself. If there's anything in any of these days that I'm talking about that I've not talked about, something that you want to leave a comment. If you're joining live and you do that, I may be able to answer it or discuss it on the video. If not, I will text about it in the chat, or perhaps do include it in a video forthcoming as well. So feel free to engage in the conversation in that way. But I'm kind of trying to give us an orientation towards some of the big picture things here. We're an important time in the story because we're moving from the time of the judges to the time of the kings. We met our first king the last time, Saul. We'll see today that Saul's got some shortcomings in the perspective of Samuel, God, and the narrator of this story that's being told here. So we're going to be kind of moving our attention and affection away from Saul and towards David. Chapter 12, where yesterday's reading, I believe, started, is a kind of extended thing from Samuel. He goes through and he talks about, again, we've seen many times now already, God's rescue of his people from Egypt, God's provision, God's sending the judges to lead them. And so then kind of at the tail end of that, it's evident that Samuel is not really a big fan of the idea of the people wanting a king. So like in verse 14 of chapter 12, he says, if you fear the Lord and serve him and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, his hand will be against you as it was against you. So basically, at the end of the day, no matter what you have or don't have for this leadership structure, if you don't obey God, none of it is going to make a difference. You have to ultimately follow what God wants, as we'll see in today's reading, that Saul does not do that, and so that becomes a pretty significant problem. And chapter 13 has kind of one of the first major issues with Saul, whether or not it seems major to us. It is in the story here, and that's that Saul is waiting to get involved in this military operation, and Samuel tells him to wait to offer this sacrifice. Wait for him to offer the sacrifice before they go. He doesn't come when Saul expects him to. Saul gets antsy. Saul offers the sacrifice without Samuel because he's nervous that if he doesn't, that he's not going to have the victory in this operation here. So he says, so Saul offers the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, I'm in verse 10, Samuel arrived and Saul went to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering and you did not come at the set time and the Philistines were assembling, I thought, now the Philistines will come down with me, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." So Saul's kind of this interesting kind of mixed character where he kind of wants to do certain things, but he doesn't do them quite the way. That's going to be the case with him. He kind of does stuff. He's got kind of obedience, but not. And so that becomes kind of part of this narrative at this particular time. So verse 13, Samuel says, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time, the way that he will for David." We'll see that to come. "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." So we have here in this statement, and what Samuel is saying here, we have in our understanding this kind of transition that Saul, who's just a new king in our perspective here, Saul's not going to make it. Now he's actually going to continue to be the king for a length of time, but God's favor isn't going to be on him. It's going to transition to David, and we'll see that even today too. So things are going kind of fast here. So let me fast forward to chapter 15. There's this instruction here, and there's a lot of details I'm not going to get into, but Saul is instructed to get rid of the Amalekites. The same sort of thing like with Jericho. We want kind of this total, this total thing. Don't spare anybody important. Don't take anything. And we'll see that this is a big deal. If you remember back to Judges, remember the sin of it's Achan, right? I think it's Achan, the guy that holds back some of the riches for himself, and that becomes a big issue in the book of Judges. So Saul spares the king of these enemy peoples and all this livestock that seemed to them good, not worth, I guess, wasting or getting rid of, right? So in verse 9 of chapter 15, "But Saul and the army spared Agag," that's the king of the Amalekites, "in the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good." So we'll see here. Let's just read it. Verse 10, "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and not carried out my instructions." This, even though it's a big problem for Saul, clues us into what God is looking for in a king. First and foremost, is someone who will listen to him. For us to have somebody in a place, a position of authority, who amongst God's people who doesn't listen to God, is a big problem. And this is not to make any kind of connection at all between kings and other types of leaders in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you have somebody that's supposed to be responsible and looked to for godly, whatever, leadership, character, teaching, whatever, and they're not following God, that's a huge problem. And so we have this, right? He didn't listen to. And look at Samuel's even emotions here. Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all night about this. Samuel is a little bit of he's an interesting character. Um, we see Saul. Samuel goes up to meet Saul. Saul has set up a monument to his own honor. So Saul started out humble. Who am I? Why should God choose me? Seems very. He was going to be a good candidate, but he becomes prideful, as so many people do when they have positions of power. And he basically, I think the idea is he's judging him for himself how obedient he wants to be. So God said this, and Saul was, well, okay, I'll generally do that, but I'll do it the way that I want to do it. Or I'll do part of it that I want to do, but not the part that I don't want to do. It doesn't seem sort of right to me, or like that's the best idea. And that's not what God's looking for. He's looking for a man after his own heart that wants to do maybe more than even is necessary, not less. And so we see again the shift away from Saul as king. And so in verse 17, we get an idea of this in this conversation with Samuel. Samuel says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of all the tribes of Israel? And he says, so why did you do this? Why did you take the plunder? Why did the plunder? It's kind of an old school word. Like the stuff that you wanted, why did you keep it for yourself? You used to be small in your own eyes. Was what part of what, not like self, like in a terrible way, right? But realize again, humility. Humility is so important. And Saul once had it, but he seems to have lost it, right? He was once small in his own eyes. He was humble. Now he's becoming more prideful. And Saul has excuses. Well, I kept the animals so that we could sacrifice them to the Lord. So this is some interesting stuff here for us to kind of think about. This kind of redefining, I'm going to do something for God, but it's not what God wanted, and it's actually the opposite of what God said. So we don't just get to say, hey, I'm going to do whatever I want and call it for God. No, that's not how this thing works. So that's what Samuel said. I'm going to sacrifice them to the Lord. And Samuel replied, verse 22. This is important stuff here, right? Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Right? So sacrifice is all through the story at this point, right? From various places focused on Leviticus, it's in Exodus, it's following, it's happening here for Samuel. Sacrifice is good in this sense. It has its place, but it never replaces obedience. Remember, even the sacrificial system was mostly for unintentional sins and for purification. You can't just not do obedience and then cover it over with sacrifice. It doesn't work that way. It's obedience, right? Listening to God and doing what he says. That's what really matters. And that doesn't change in the New Testament when it comes to following Jesus as well. People like his disciples sometimes would try to do what seemed good to them. And Jesus wants them to listen to him. Listen to what he says, right? There's just a lot in here of affirmation. Samuel is very bold with Saul that look, God's favor here is off of you. Your kingdom is not going to last. It's not going to endure. Verse 28, I'm still in chapter 15. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one who is better than you. Ouch. And he says this is it. This is the total last. So Saul's kind of trying to negotiate, and this is one of those instances. Remember, we looked at, it's sort of fascinating where it says here in these narratives that the Lord regretted making Saul king, and we have in some like this God does not lie or change his mind. So we need to make sense of a big picture. I think we can do it, but a big picture of this. But when God makes a declaration or commitment, it means something. We've talked a lot about people making oaths. I don't think when God does something, he wouldn't call it necessarily an oath. But when he says this is it, take that really seriously, right? So just an example of that. What I'm saying, I'm just not making it up. Verse 35. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. It's really interesting to think about what that would be like, but just not enough time. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Right? Saul did not live up to expectations of the kind of king that he would make. In chapter 16, Samuel anoints David. Again, I'm going to wrap up here quickly, not talk a lot about David. We'll have plenty of time to talk about David. But these two stories are probably amongst the most well-known in the Bible. Hopefully you've read them over again. Maybe you'll see some new things here. Hopefully as well. Point being, in a lot of ways here, that it's not the oldest, it's not the tallest, it's not the whatever that God picks. God chooses David very unequivocally. He is anointed. Remember the Mashiach, Messiah anointing, and so that happens here with David. And it's really important with David because we'll see later, right, that his line, his kingdom will endure, will ultimately find its fulfillment in Jesus much later on. So, right. So verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. So then we have the thing which we'll talk about next time. Probably no video tomorrow, Saturday. I usually don't do. Now there's this overlap where Saul was the king. God's favor is off of him, and now it's on to David. But Saul still occupies the throne on the ground logistically. David's going to go to work for him, and now it gets to be a challenging, complicated situation. But there we have it. This is the big picture. We're walking through it. Let me know what you're thinking, what your comments are, what your questions or thoughts, etc. Hope you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you hopefully on Monday. Bye.